When you hear the word Nazca, you probably think of the lines, etched like giant secrets in the desert meant to be seen from the heavens. You think of mummies, carefully preserved behind museum glass. But that's the official tour. That's the story after it's been cleaned up and put on display. This film is what happens when you leave the tour bus behind. When you push past the signposts and follow the forgotten paths into the heart of the desert. This is the ultimate Nazca collection. A layered history of empires that rose and fell like the Wari, Inca, and Paracas. To create this film, I've reached deep into the channel's archives from the last expedition to put together the most critical moments into a single definitive journey. It's a look at sites that served and shaped empires, enigmas that continue to baffle us today, and sites that you will never see in guidebooks or on maps. Out here, shifting sands reveal lost cities swallowed by dunes. We will find the fragments of a vanished world, artifacts that defy the archaeological record, textiles and tools of the peoples that once lived here, and we will find them among the devastating remains of ancestors in a horizon of looting. For some of these places, this is the only media that exists of them. We'll climb to mountaintop fortresses, receive help from descendants, and encounter objects that some say challenge the historical narrative. This is Nazca without the filter. Raw, real, full of fragile beauty and devastating reality. This is the stuff most don't get to see. Welcome to Pillars of the Past. I saw these structures on a valley ridge in the desert in southern Peru, and I knew I had to check them out. But there was more. Looting pits. Miles of looting pits. I've seen looting pits covering a vast amount of ground before, but this here was obscene. The looting stretched for almost 8 full kilometers along these ridges. So along the way, I knew I had to at least try to make it onto them to document what may or may not have been left. First, though, I would try to navigate to the structures. I was approaching the ridge along this path here. And along the way, you can see that there were some looting pits, here, tucked in between this little valley. Looters had clearly been here, as there were a couple of exhumed bones in several locations. I continued trying to make my way to the ridge. As I made my way to the top, I was coming upon this structure here. What was left of these structures were crumbled stones. They didn't appear to be tombs to me, or else I feel like I would have been seeing more bones and pieces of artifacts than I currently was. I'm a bit more inclined to think it might have been the vestige of a settlement or perhaps some sort of storage purposes. It was a little strange to not be finding things laid about the site like I have in other locations, so I wonder if the entire settlement or whatever was here collectively abandoned it at some point. There wasn't much else to see, as it seemed the only thing left of these crumbled walls was an outline of their foundations. Seeing just how many enclosures there were from the drone was pretty amazing. But what started to begin on the next ridge was crushing. Each one of these holes you see along these ridges is a looting pit. Looting of historical sites, of course, began during the Spanish Conquest, out of the search for artifacts and metals of precious value. But what you're seeing here, this is modern looting. In most areas, looting has been such a severe issue that more has been lost in the last 2 decades of the 20th century than the prior 5 centuries since Spanish conquest. You can see the landscape. It's obliterated with pochmarks. It hurts your heart. And this goes on for almost 8 full kilometers. And this is what things look like when you get closer. It leaves you speechless. I had to try to find a way to document what some of these looked like. You could see bones scattered everywhere, some even still attached to the funerary wrappings they were once in. There's brown cotton and white cotton that the deceased were buried in, and you can see that strewn about all over the place. Often the deceased were buried with food and other items for their transition into the afterlife, and this here is an example of the maize that is often exhumed and interspersed from these burials. It's possible that some of these burials contained additional skulls besides just the one interred individual, and that's because the Nazca kept trophy heads from vanquished enemies. It was believed that in death, the spirit of the enemy was actually bound in servitude to them. And you could see rope here that was often tied around the cotton and textiles that were once wrapped around the body of a mummy. You can see more rope here. This was definitely recent looting from the past few decades, and you could tell that because of the trash that was left behind. Things like soda bottles, cans of food, packs of cigarettes from a certain era. The deceased are so well preserved in this region because of the arid environment. Even hair is preserved. There were beautiful fragments of pottery throughout the site, and the iconography suggested the Nazca culture to me. I have seen several skulls with indications of trepanation, which was an early example of surgery to the brain thousands of years ago. It is assumingly based on the belief that drilling a hole into the brain would allow the evil spirits to find a way out for the afflicted individual. There's more cotton and clothing here. It appears to be an occasional practice at many of these burial sites where skulls seem to be set up on display. Remember, this is just a fraction, a minuscule percentage of what can be seen for 8 full kilometers. That chilling landscape of countless pits shows the sheer scale of the destruction. It's a wound in the desert that goes on for kilometers. But to understand what's truly being lost, we have to move away from the wide view and step into the heart of a settlement, a place where families built homes, an unknown site whose history is written in the stones and the bones. I came across this unlabeled site here in a valley nestled along the periphery of the riverbed. It was clear to me that this had to be the ruins of ancient architecture, and that the site itself appears to have been vastly looted. I had to go check it out and document what might be left. And I didn't put it together until making this video, but take note of these reeds here growing along the bed of the valley, because we will see it later. I was in southern Peru in the Paracas and Nazca region. It was clear to see that some walls were left standing, somewhat intact, but the majority of those walls had crumbled, leaving the stones littered across the landscape. I entered the site from this direction and started to make my way through.
Dug deep here.
Everywhere you could see stones and piles where the walls used to be. The site had obviously been looted, and I could barely take a step without running into multiple pottery fragments.
Large pieces of pottery.
Based on the construction method of the stones, the pieces of pottery, and the textiles I would find at the site, I would have to say that this was likely attributed to the Paracas or Nazca culture. The Paracas flourished from 800 BCE to about 100 BCE and were directly followed by the Nazca, who were around until about 600 CE. Both used small stones joined with calcareous mud to form the foundations and walls, and occasionally used wood from the huarango tree as beams for roofing, and would also use reeds and thatch in an adobe mud mixture to help shape those walls and those roofs. You'll frequently find maize at many of the burials because the deceased were buried with them, usually in pieces of pottery, to take with them on their journey in the afterlife.
Wow, they dug deep in here.
There was this huge piece of intact pottery, which you don't come across very often, as so much is either broken or removed by looters, but perhaps it was left because of its relative plainness, because as you'll see later in this video, some of the pieces at this site were beautifully designed. It looked like it was exhumed from the looted pit right next to it because there were pieces of cotton. And this piece of rope here looked like it might have been a sling where you could put a rock in the middle and use it as a weapon. You can see bones left carelessly strewn about the site, an unfortunate but typical result of looting.
There's structure underneath here. They're digging through the roofs.
In some of the looted pits, you can see that a layer of thatch had been broken through, either roofs or possibly the tops of burials in my estimation. You could also see how deep some of these structures go, and just how much remains unexcavated. At first I thought this was a piece of pottery, but it was actually a stone that had painted designs on it.
They were drawing on it.
Some of the same type of designs and pigment that are found on the pottery. This was an expansive city with multiple homes, and given that there was clearly structure buried deep underneath the surface, I wondered if subsequent cultures could have repurposed this location. Because these walls here share some similarities with the northern Wayuri, but they're also just a bit more rudimentary than what they were known for. So I wonder if this was a population that potentially occupied this area before the Wayuri, but after the Nazca. There's a piece of wood here, and you'll see several throughout the site, probably the huarango wood used by the Paracas as support beams. And inside the pit that it probably came from, you can see thatch and reeds poking through the walls. Here was another one of those rope bands, which probably came out of a burial next to a piece of cotton and maize. And right next to it was this beautifully patterned pottery sherd, which seemed to be consistent with the Paracas or Nazca culture. As I kept snaking my way through the site, the drone helped to make out more of the foundations of some of these structures. But it also showed the depth and the extent of the looting that had taken place here. This site is about 35 miles inland from the coast of Peru, so it was pretty wild to be finding seashells peppered throughout the site. Now, it wasn't an extensive amount, but they were scattered throughout the location, and although it could be the result of some sort of monumental environmental shift, it was more likely the result of a vast network of trade. This huge piece of pottery is consistent with the kind one would find in a burial, and near it were human bones, cotton, and rope. It was clear that looters had broken through some sort of thatched structure, which again made me naturally wonder how deep might this architecture still go.
That's a dog.
It's likely that this poor animal had been accompanying some of the looters over the past few decades, and something happened to it and it was simply left in one of the dug pits. Scanning the site with both the drone and from the satellite, there was a patch of debris here that I also needed to check out, so I started to make my way. Walking through the middle of the site, I came across another large piece of pottery, and even more indications of those layers of thatch that seemed to be buried underneath my feet.
There's walls all under here.
But in this pit here was the best evidence for full-length reeds. Those same reeds I saw growing in the valley as I was driving to the site itself. It made it pretty clear to me, at least, that these were in fact being used as structural components for the buildings here at the site.
My God.
As I got closer to that patch of debris, it became pretty apparent what it was, and it was sad. It was trash. And it seemed like this little section of the site was almost used like a landfill, as this trash was all the same material and contained the same contents. Unfortunately, this is not an abnormal occurrence to find at obscure sites and locations in Peru. Next, I wanted to make it to this upper section. And I was continuing to find pottery sherds and some pieces of larger ceramic vessels, typical of the burials in this region. But this was a pretty exciting find, an ancient sandal made of the same rope material that would be wrapped around the mummies. This area of the site is where I started to find the most polychrome pottery with those beautiful and intricate designs. So this was in part evidence to me that at least at some point the Nazca had occupied this location. They were the first to implement the technique of painting on the clay before firing the ceramic. This piece here was oddly heavy in comparison to the other pieces of ceramics I was finding. It clearly appeared to be burnt, so maybe it had a specific purpose in a home for some sort of cooking. Right next to it is a good example of the reeds as they are vertically sticking out from the ground. It's possible that this pile of brown and white cotton was being stored here and became unearthed during the looting process, but the fact that there were bones nearby indicated to me that it was more likely, unfortunately, from a mummy that was once wrapped in the material. This find here was pretty remarkable, and the first time I had come across a piece of textile with artwork on it. It was pretty faint, but it also helped to solidify the notion that the Paracas may have occupied this territory before the Nazca, as it was the Paracas who really cultivated this type of technique of embroidery. The Nazca did it as well, and given that these two cultures were on the heels of one another, it's possible that this site was home to them both. At several sites in the Peruvian desert, caches of crops are consistently found. These caches are a storage of resources for the communities that once occupied the area, and that's what I believe I was finding here towards the edge of this portion of the site. There were so many pieces of maize that attributing it to a burial didn't make much sense, so I think what looters found here were some of those storage caches. Making my way back to where I had entered the site, from higher up along the mountain here, it was easier to make out the foundational outlines of the structures. There was still one part of this site that I wanted to check out, and it was directly across on the opposite side from the main location. You can see more reeds poking out from the earth, all in a uniform line and bundled together, which speaks to purposeful construction. It's possible that some of these ropes were maybe nets, but again, being 35 miles from the coast where nets were mainly used for fishing, it would make it more likely that these ropes here were actually those used on the mummy bundles of the deceased. I wasn't fully prepared for what I was about to see exploring this side of the site. I've seen looting at virtually every place I've been to in Peru, but the savagery of what was on display here was on another level.
Oh my gosh. It just goes on.
It became apparent that the cotton and textile was all from exhumed burials.
Oh wow.
There were several amazing and beautifully designed pieces of pottery that really spoke to the advancement of the cultural identity of the ancient peoples that lived here. This other piece, the spout of a jar, was colored with the typical red and black pigment found in the region. But beyond that, it was sculpted to have a face, with a nose that was actually protruding from the vessel itself. I climbed up onto the next ridge to get a better vantage point of the area, and I was pretty shocked to see that there were undeniable stone walls buried deep in the sand and sediment.
There's structure underneath. This is insane. So all of that, it's not, there's trash amongst it, but all of that is cotton, textile, from what the mummies were usually wrapped in. You can still look at the mummies that they have on display from down south, the ones that are on display as they've been preserved and as they found them.
I was trying to imagine the greed and the intent that it would take to literally tear these mummies apart to find any goods that they might have been buried with. The level of destruction and desecration of the ancestors buried here was brutal. You could see bones still wrapped in the cotton, and since the desert preserves things so well, you can even see the red hair attached to the skull, which has been a common feature found amongst the ancient Paracas peoples. It was a devastating thing to soak in. These were all once fully intact. Here was the hand of another ancestor, completely removed from its remains and its resting place. It hurts your heart to witness something like this level of desecration. And there's clearly such a need to protect and preserve ancient sites like this, and they still have so much left to uncover and to teach us. These were the last vestiges of individual lives torn from their final resting places. The exposed sling at the site hints at a possible episode of violence in its history, but the modern trash also confirms recent looting. But to understand the true extent of the desecration here, we first have to take a look at how it was meant to be, a place where the ancestors still remain, in peace. We now go to the Chauchilla Cemetery. I came across this location using Google Earth. It was clear that definite looting had taken place, but I also thought that I could see the faint outlines of potential architecture, so I decided to check it out. Getting to the site and using the drone, I was able to verify those outlines of ancient architecture, but it was still clearly buried in the sands. And as I got the drone closer to the ground, I could see that many ancestors had been buried here, and unfortunately, their remains had been looted and left scattered throughout the site. There were funerary belongings, skulls, bones, textile, rope, pottery sherds, and trash everywhere. Before taking a closer look, and for the best context possible, I want to first take you to the Chauchilla Cemetery in Nazca, Peru. The mummies you'll see here are thousands of years old, dating as far back as 200 CE. This site has not been recreated. It has been preserved for the public to see how these mummies were found in their original resting places with their original funerary wrappings in this necropolis. I was apparently the only one to visit the site this day, and so the attendant took some time to walk me through the little adjacent museum, which also displayed original mummies. It's difficult to see because of the light, but he said that this mummy here was a member of the elite class, and you can tell that because of the textile she was wrapped in and the artifacts she was buried with.
¿Por qué esto se ha conservado a estas personas? Por el mismo clima que es seco y no llueve.
He explained that due to the climate, these mummies are so well preserved, and added that prior to burial, the bodies would be thoroughly cleaned, including the removal of internal organs, cleaning them, and then placing them back before proceeding with the funerary process. Now, these other two mummies, he explained, were of a lower, more general class, which could be ascertained by their funerary wrappings.
¿Por qué lo envolvían con algodón? Porque este era un niño de familia vulnerada, pobre.
Ah, los pobres son en la...
They were wrapped in layers of cotton and secured with rope, all of which you can see at the burial site that I explored.
La posición que ellos tienen es estar mirando hacia el sol. ¿Por qué? Porque ellos creían en el sol, porque para ellos era su Dios.
He explained that the mummies were typically placed facing the sun, in accordance with the worship of the sun being the chief deity of the culture. He also pointed out the native warango tree, which he said that the cultures used to make coverings for their structures, things like roofs. This is a better shot of the huarango tree as I was walking up to the museum. He then proceeded to show me the brown cotton that still grows in the region today and was used by the ancients in these funerary practices.
Esta es fibra.
La fibra.
Esta fibra,
He picked it right off the plant,
esta es la semilla.
and after removing the seeds, showed me how the ancients used this fiber to craft their textiles and other goods.
Lo trabajaban y hacían el hilo. Y con eso hacían sus tejidos.
Ah, yeah.
Exacto. Y ahí,
Todos.
ya todo échale. Ya así, lo tapa.
So now that we've seen all that, let's head 60 kilometers away to that unnamed burial site I was currently exploring. As I walked up, I immediately saw the disheveled wrappings of what the bodies used to be buried in. There was the cotton, textile, rope, and bones, all consistent with these once being interred mummies of the deceased. Walking through these dunes, I was sure that I was walking over buried architecture.
Wow. There's structure under
Which was confirmed when I came upon this here, an exposed adobe brick wall. And as I made my way to the side here, you could see more funerary wrappings, but also see that there were exposed adobe bricks on both sides, almost forming an entranceway. Given that this was adobe brick and not stone with mud plastered to the sides, I am assuming that this is very ancient and likely dates back to the Paracas culture.
huge piece of pottery.
There were these huge ornate pieces of pottery next to a cardboard box, no doubt a modern piece of trash left by looters. This entire location was littered with incredible artifacts and the funerary wrappings and bones of ancestors, which is such an unfortunate and all too common occurrence in these remote regions. There were so many skulls at this site that it was likely indicative of the trophy heads we've become familiar with. Some of these artifacts were exquisite. Their designs reaffirmed Paracas and Nazca origin to me. You could see more adobe bricks peeking out from the dunes and pieces of wood, likely that huarango tree, being used to help fortify or form some of the architecture that remains unexcavated. All over the site, there were fragments with geometric designs and patterns, painted with precision. Often abstract shapes like triangles, rectangles, circles, spirals, and zigzags are stylized and combined into intricate patterns, and these elements are thought to have held cultural or spiritual significance, potentially representing natural elements like plants, animals, or celestial bodies. It's very rare to find intact artifacts, so I was surprised when I came across this almost complete funerary jar. You can see that its impressive colors have withstood the test of time for millennia. And it is at this location that I witnessed my first elongated skull outside of a museum. But it wouldn't be my last. The amount of desecration here was disturbing. The mummies of these ancestors were ravaged, utterly destroyed by looters seeking precious treasures.
Oh my gosh.
Here's a bottle of Inca Cola next to an ancestor's rib cage, spinal cord, and cotton. And here you can see an entire foot and shin bone, with what appears to be layers of cotton still stuck to the remains. Coming across sites like this is sad and devastating, and it's regretful how much history and possible information has been lost due to factors like looting. We can't change the past and what's been done, but looking ahead to the future, I believe that there is a light. And that is because there is clearly still a lot out here, buried, undiscovered, and unexcavated. And the potential to make discoveries and see things as they once were is still out there. The piece at Chauchilla is a testament to a culture's reverence for the afterlife. But while their tombs reveal much about their views on death, the surrounding landscape holds even stranger secrets about their lives. The expedition now pivots from the known rituals of burials to a monumental enigma carved into the earth, a feature that asks a question about human endeavor that we still struggle to answer. This is the Band of Holes. Imagine flying over a landscape seemingly untouched for millennia, an endless desert stretching towards the horizon. But then, as you look closer, a pattern emerges. Something utterly unexpected, but something deliberate. Scattered across this desolate terrain, etched into the very fabric of the earth, lies a feature that has baffled researchers for decades. It's known as the Band of Holes, or Monte Sierpe, Serpent Mountain. And from above, its true enigmatic nature begins to unfold. These are not random depressions. These are precisely dug holes arranged in lines in clusters, snaking across the hillsides for kilometers. There are thousands of them. What force, what purpose could have driven an ancient people to create such a monumental and peculiar undertaking? On the ground, you can see that each of these holes was carefully constructed with stacked stones to form these circular enclosures. Many theories about these holes have persisted for decades. Were these for storage? Did each hole hold some sort of vital resource for the arid landscape, grain or water, or something else entirely? Some suggest a defensive purpose, a series of obstacles to deter invaders, but their seemingly random placement and vast extent make that feel a little incomplete. Others believe they played a role in water management, perhaps a complex system of wells or reservoirs. Yet the lack of clear irrigation channels or collection points also makes that explanation feel a little incomplete. There are also a handful of more esoteric theories. Could this have been some form of an astronomical marker? Maybe a giant calendar etched into the earth? Well, to date, nothing has fully substantiated those theories either. Any way you look at it, though, the sheer scale of this landmark hints at something profound. Unlike the recognizable structures of cities or tombs, the Band of Holes, it speaks a different language. A visual puzzle on a scale that dwarfs our individual understanding. It's a stark reminder that the ancient world held mysteries that we are still struggling to unravel. There were also some structures here on the adjacent hillside. It's possible that this was perhaps some form of terracing, but typically you'd see a lot more of those square and rectangle shapes grouped closer together. But there are clearly defined walls, so it does bring up the likelihood that these two locations were operating in tandem somehow. Doing what exactly? Well, maybe in time one of those theories gets proven correct. Or perhaps an answer reveals itself to a question none of us have thought to ask yet. And again, it just further proves that even at the apex of our technological advancements, there are still many things about our ancient past that remain elusive. The Band of Holes is a silent testament to a system of knowledge now lost to us. But while the purpose of these holes might remain a mystery, the spiritual heart of the Nazca does not. From a landscape of questions, we now travel to a place of answers. the great ceremonial center of Cahuachi. Located in the arid deserts of southern Peru, is one of the most significant archaeological sites associated with the Nazca culture, Cahuachi. Often said to be the capital city of the Nazca culture, evidence suggests that it was actually not a city at all. Instead, these monumental adobe structures served as a ceremonial and pilgrimage site. The site itself had continuous occupation from approximately 400 BCE to 450 CE and provides invaluable insights into the spiritual and ritualistic practices of the Nazca people. Although bustling with activity when utilized, Cahuachi was not a site of sustained residential life. There's actually little evidence of domestic activity, such as housing or marketplaces, which one would expect in a traditional city. There is, however, an area to the side of the Great Temple that is thought to have been for residential purposes. However, it would only accommodate a small number of people, and it is therefore assumed that those living in those quarters were likely the caretakers of the site. Walking through this corridor, it's easier to see the individual adobe bricks responsible for the construction of this incredible monument. Archaeologists have attributed construction to being completed in 5 phases, the very first of which has been dated to approximately 400 to 200 BCE, and this estimate is not based on the dating of artifacts or remains. It is based on the stratigraphy of geological layers that formed the initial foundation where large walls were discovered. Subsequent phases would see the addition of adobe mud brick in the creation of various temples, rooms, and plazas. These adobe mud bricks were then covered in a plaster material mixed from locally sourced elements. And you can see just how much of the exterior of this site still retains the smooth exterior of the plaster, housing the adobe brick underneath. This is in part due to the arid environment preserving these structural conditions. The central pyramid, known as the Great Pyramid, has a base of 150 by 100 meters, and it's almost 30 meters tall. In 1952, archaeologist William Duncan Strong from Columbia University conducted excavations, and he wrote in his journal how disappointed he was that he wasn't finding exceedingly rich burials at the site. Instead, one of the most notable artifacts he did find was the largest single piece of cloth ever woven in the Western Hemisphere. Unfortunately, the procedural execution of their excavation tore it in a few places, but putting those large pieces together that were found, it was estimated that this one unified piece of cloth was between 164 to 200 feet long. There were a few rooms in a particular area of this site that is thought to have perhaps been a workshop for weaving, as excavations found various instruments and tools used to make textiles, like spindles, dyes, cotton, threads. There were burials found at the site, but nothing as magnanimous as Strong had clearly hoped. Several burials, though, were found in rooms, but they were set up in a ritualistic manner, typically with offerings and trophy heads. And you can see some of the heads that were discovered at Cahuachi here. Another archaeologist who excavated Cahuachi in the 1980s, Helene Silverman, postulated that Cahuachi was the destination of several ceremonial pilgrimages that took place during certain times of the year, and these pilgrimages involved traversing the vast Nazca Desert. This consideration has led to theorizing that some of the Nazca lines pointed people or directed them to the ceremonial center. A similar theory was echoed by Dr. Ed Barnhart in my interview with him, that perhaps these lines were designed during those journeys of pilgrimage by the people coming to and from this religious center. There are still occasionally active excavations happening at the site of Cahuachi, and as you could see, you're limited to a small walking path when you go visit the site. The reasons for Cahuachi's decline remain the subject of debate. And while many factors indicate environmental shifts such as drought that perhaps led to the abandonment of the site, other research suggests that other rivaling political centers and the rise of other factions around the 7th century CE contributed to the decline of the site. Cahuachi was the great public stage of Nazca belief, a place of massive pyramids and grand ceremony. But faith and mystery were not confined to these temple walls, because not too far from this spiritual heartland, in one of the many forgotten valleys, lies a site that, although much of it is swallowed by the desert dunes, exposed adobe structures hint at a massive city underneath. But there was something else buried here, an artifact larger than anything in the current archaeological record. Using Google Earth, I saw these structures. From prior research, it was kind of clear to me that they were likely the remnants of ancient architecture, and it was pretty vast, sprawling across this entire portion of the desert. There was some sort of abandoned industrial facility here, but it was clear to me from the satellite that there was still much appearing to be underground. I had to check it out. As I got to the area, I started on this side of the complex here, and was shocked to see just how much of the monumental structure was above ground. These were massive adobe bricks, and both the Nazca and Paracas cultures were known to have utilized this construction method, as the mixture of clay and water to make the bricks was well suited for the arid desert environment. Some of the walls did remind me of the Cahuachi pyramids with the adobe bricks covered in plaster, so perhaps this was a Nazca settlement.
Pieces of pottery, seashells. They look like sandstone bricks that have been weathered over time.
You can find adobe structures up and down the coast of Peru, and sometimes these bricks could weigh up to 100 tons. Now, these ones here at the site were incredibly weathered, but they were also incredibly large.
Pieces of bone everywhere, so people were finding things.
People in modern times had definitely been here and not only left their marks on the landscape, but also on the adobe structures themselves, as you could see people's names etched into the adobe bricks all over the place. I was finding seashells, bones, and pottery littered throughout the site. The presence of such a vast amount of seashells indicated either an incredibly rich and frequent trade network with cultures that lived on the coast, or that the sea itself was once a lot closer to this desert than it currently is.
Clearly some windows here.
Moving further into the complex, I started to make my way to this area here, which also had architecture consistent with the structures we had just seen, although the adobe bricks themselves seemed a bit smaller. Again, tons of pottery shards, seashells, and human remains.
Well, there's a big hole here. What the hell? Oh my gosh, is this one big piece of ceramic? I've never seen anything like that before in my life. I also just want to picture it for proportion.
We will come back to this shortly. This is where I had entered the complex, and I began to make my way to the opposite corner. Along the way, I was able to see the complexity of the structures that were still clearly buried under the sand.
So if you clear off enough, you can find the stones. See the depression? It's these stones that are stacked up.
You can also see the massive amounts of looting pits at this site.
There's a big pit right there.
This felt like a temple of some sort, given its height and pyramidal shape as I approached the apex. The stones were incredibly large, and there were identifiable sections that appeared to be rooms and entranceways. There was also a layer of thatch in a few places, which was strange. However, we have seen that in other locations we have explored. And at those locations, the cultures living in these regions were using this thatch for the roofs of their structures. So that just indicates how deeply some of this stuff might be buried. And along those lines, it's clear to tell that in several spots, there are adobe walls going into the sand that have yet to be excavated.
There's structure all underneath here.
This area of the complex had by far the densest collection of human remains, pottery sherds, and textile fragments. And you couldn't walk anywhere without running into several. That and copious amounts of trash from whoever came looking for things. We have seen preserved and desecrated mummies in prior locations. The haphazard way that the remains, cotton, and textile were strewn about the place here was consistent, I believe, with looters looking for artifacts of precious value on the persons themselves. Amidst the debris was this primitive knitting tool, which was pretty awesome to find, and it made me think that unless it was exhumed from one of the burials, that it is likely people were once living here, as this is an example of a mundane activity of habitation. Again, seashells were abundant everywhere. And I wasn't quite sure what to make of these bundles of thatch. But this here seemed to be a woven article, perhaps a basket. And of course, the most disturbing thing to come across are the unearthed limbs of the deceased. And although seeing these remains is such a frequent occurrence that it is certainly possible to become desensitized to it, seeing remains still attached to their funerary wrappings,
that looks like a foot,
is a shock to the system that brings you back to the reality of the devastation. And not too far from the feet was the elongated skull of an ancestor with a detached jaw. And as mysterious as these elongated skulls indeed are, this region perhaps has the greatest influx of them. And although head binding was a well-known cultural practice of the Paracas and Nazca peoples, there do remain many skulls that contain anomalies, indicating that they may not have been bound. And perhaps in time, a missing chapter of our human history and evolution may come to light. But now I want to circle back to this site's other prevalent mystery, this artifact. I've scoured through archaeological records and I've combed through museum exhibits to see if I could find anything comparable that would speak to something of this magnitude. And I'm truly at a loss because, at least in Peru, there is nothing like this. Most of the documentation on ceramics in this region tend to typically cover the beautifully designed polychrome pottery of the Nazca people and the earlier Paracas peoples. And don't get me wrong, occasionally there were funerary urns that were large and massive as well, but they didn't reach above 2 or 3 feet in size. I did come across a recent discovery that was made just a couple weeks ago, and this was down in Brazil in the Amazon jungle. Huge funerary urns were found, and within them were the remains of pre-Columbian peoples, along with things like seeds and the bones of fish and turtles and frogs. And you can see the size of those from these images, but they just don't compare to what I'm standing in. It's possible that there was potentially a mummy bundle that was found within this ceramic vessel. However, there are hundreds and hundreds of mummy bundles that have been found in these regions, and none of them were interred in something like this. That fact leads me to believe that this ceramic vessel was more likely than not used for some sort of storage. And being buried under the hot desert sand makes sense because it would help to cool whatever was in there and preserve it for longer periods of time. I did end up finding something comparable being constructed right around the same time, the Roman dolium. Dolia were massive pieces of ceramic that were often as tall or larger than a full person. They were used primarily for storing and fermenting food and liquid, things like wine, olive oil, or grain. And because they were so large, they were often partially sunk into the ground. It is important to note, though, that there were typically several of these placed in close proximity to each other, aligned in a formation to cultivate whatever was being fermented within them. That being said, what's the likelihood that there's more of these ceramic vessels buried here in the sand? That massive vessel is, at least for now, a singular puzzle, and a testament to the incredible skill and potential secrets of the artisans who created it. But to understand how a civilization could support such specialized craftsmanship and build monumental centers like Cahuachi, we need to understand its engine. So we now zoom out to see that engine at work. A feat of agricultural engineering on an epic scale, built to power an empire. As I was surveying this southern coastal valley in Peru using Google Earth, I came across these structures stretching for over half of a mile, covering this entire face of this mountain range. At first I thought maybe it was a vast city, but seeing the uniformity of these structures, I reconsidered and thought that it actually might be ancient terracing, so I decided to go check it out. I got the Jeep as close as I could and started to make my way on foot. Fortunately, I came across the owners of the farmland between me and the site, and I was lucky enough to meet Chris Santos, who owned the property. He graciously walked me to the site, and on the way, I asked him about it.
¿El nombre?
Este se llama Media Luna.
Media Luna.
Sí, Media Luna.
He said it was called Media Luna, or half moon, and it was very ancient.
¿Y tú qué piensas que es ese sitio?
Pienso que ha sido pues una cultura antigua.
Oh, sí, sí, yo pienso.
Claro, y que ya los restos ya no se encuentran ya casi algunas cosas más que se han quedado ahí.
Mm-hmm.
He added that a lot of artifacts had been found and left there.
Muchas gracias para tu tiempo aquí.
No, pues de todas maneras, pues tengo que enseñarte.
¿Y sabes qué cosas se encontró los arqueológicos o no?
Sí, aquí han encontrado ollitas.
Ollitas.
Ollitas de barro, pues.
Ah, yeah.
Sí.
He said archaeologists had come decades ago, and I asked him what types of things they were finding, and he said that they found a lot of little pots with grain inside.
Estos han sido andenes, son andenes que lo ha dividido así.
Y andenes es para la agricultura.
Claro, pues.
Ah, ya.
Todo eso llega, mira, al otro lado.
Sí,
pues,
sí. Es el mismo.
Es el mismo, así ya, pero... Ya, entonces hasta acá lo acompaño, ¿ya?
Sí, ya. Muchas
Yo estaré ahí
gracias.
en la casa, baja nomás.
Ya, ¿y tu nombre otra vez?
Crisanto, pe.
Crisanto,
Ajá.
perfecto, perfecto.
Ya.
Muchas gracias,
Ya,
Crisanto.
Ya, por ahí. ¿no?
Ya, me voy a caminar a buscar. Ya, muchas gracias. So, my guide, Crisantos, and when I say guide, I mean this was his property. So now I'm now exploring things with his dogs here. Because he walked me to it. It was very, very nice, and he said that the part I'm walking in now is terracing, which you can't really see much of what you're walking in. But when I put the drone in the air, I can see it from a distance for sure.
He said that the structures at the site were andenes, or terracing, which led me to wonder which cultures could have produced such a large scale of crop cultivation. This region has been occupied by many cultures over several thousand years, and something this massive leads me to assume that it was probably the Inca. And the Inca were likely repurposing and expanding what probably started out as terracing initially by the Wari culture, as they were the ones responsible for the innovation of the sloped mountainside approach to layered terracing. And after the dissolution of the Wari Empire, it was the Chincha who came to dominate this southern region of Peru. And the Chincha were subsequently absorbed into the expanding Inca Empire. This was clearly a massive operation, which indicated to me that there had to be comparable residential areas nearby, or other ancient structures that would justify the need for such a large scale of production. And going back to Google Earth, I was able to identify several sites peppered throughout surrounding valleys within a 20-kilometer radius. The most notable site was Tambo, Colorado, which I would stop by next. As I was leaving the site and their property, I was met by Crisantos' wife, Rosa, who stopped me to show a piece of pottery she had found not too deeply buried on her property.
Sí, ahí.
Acá lo encontré ahí.
Muy bonito.
Ahí también me encontré bastante platos rotos,
Sí.
pero con dibujitos bonitos.
She added that they were frequently finding fragments, sometimes ones with beautiful designs. And she also pointed out half-buried original Inca stonework that seemed to be a walkway or a path of some
Es
sort.
como pircao es.
Wow.
Pero allá también es como pircao era. Allá yo encontré más bonitos platos dibujados a la clan.
Ah, qué raro. Eso es magnífico, ¿no? ¿Y tu nombre otra vez?
Rosa.
Rosa. Ya. Muchas gracias para tu tiempo,
Ya.
para todo esto, ¿ya?
Ya, gracias.
Gracias.
Tony. Ya.
Y gracias para enseñarme eso.
Ya.
I thanked Rosa for her time, and while there was still daylight left, I figured I should try to make it to that prominent site I had seen on Google Earth.
This is a speed walk tour of Tambo, Colorado, because I got here at 5 p.m. when they're closing. Literally 5:03. So, just gonna do a quick little walking tour.
Tambo, Colorado was one of the largest Incan administration centers in this region and is said to have been constructed by the Inca around 1450 CE under the reign of Pachacuti. Tambos, or tampus in the native Quechua language, served multiple purposes, some as resting places or storage facilities, and others as administrative and military centers. As the Inca continued to develop interconnected roads, these tambos were erected roughly 1 day's travel apart from one another, and the remnants of these tambos can still be found today, spaced anywhere from 20 to 30 kilometers apart. Tambo, Colorado was itself called Pucallacta or Pucawasi in the original Quechua language, meaning red house or red resting place, as the word puca means red. and this was due to the reddish color of the adobe walls, and in some locations you can still see some of the surviving colors that were painted on these walls, including red. It is thought that Pachacuti, recognizing the strategic position of this particular tambo, ordered its construction to serve as a place for warriors and dignitaries. Its location, being along a centralized route connecting territories of the expanding Inca Empire, made it an important complex with one of its prime responsibilities being to maintain order in the region. I believe that the immense terracing I saw earlier served this tambo, not only to replenish and sustain any military forces that might have been stationed here and in the surrounding regions, but also because if the tambo itself got a lot of traffic, the agriculture being sustained from the region could easily be transported by the groups traveling through this site to various other areas of the empire. If it's true what is said about Emperor Pachacuti wanting this location to be a place where dignitaries travel to or through, well, I'd imagine you'd have as many resources as possible to show the prosperity of the empire. And given the relative instability of some of the cultures that were ultimately absorbed by the Incan Empire, I imagine that the need for control was prevalent. And so to have enough resources to support a military campaign or troops being stationed in those regions would also make sense to me. From the sprawling terraces of Media Luna to the imposing walls of Tambo, Colorado, you can feel the power and organization that fed an empire. But survival in this land wasn't just about food. It was about vigilance, preparation, and accessibility. From here, we leave the valley and we ascend into the surrounding peaks to what seems to be a silent stone fortress where ancestors once kept watch over their domain. I came across the remnants of this ancient settlement here. Although there wasn't a Ministry of Culture sign that I could see, being this close to a road makes it impossible that it wasn't cataloged somewhere, as it was clearly an ancient site. But this was not my point of interest. I wanted to get my eyes on and document what was way up here, tucked away, hidden between and on the tops of these mountain peaks. I got to the site and sent the drone up as recon to verify what I was assuming was ancient architecture. And indeed, it turned out to be the case, and I was going to have to try to check it out. I managed to get the Jeep closer to this location here. And I sent the drone up to chart a course through the mountains, and when I did, it was clear that this entire section was full of looting pits. You could see the unearthed skeletal remains of ancestors, textiles, and other artifacts, but since this is where I had parked, I would check this out on my return. From the drone, I caught a glimpse of these footpaths snaking their way up the mountain, and I was shocked to see that they led to caves. So I definitely had to check that out.
Alright, I saw these caves up here with the drone, so I'm gonna head to them.
You can unfortunately see piles of trash on the periphery of this location. These paths, especially the ones that are seen following the ridges along the mountain peaks, reminded me of the vast network of Inca footpaths that the runners would utilize to relay messages throughout the empire. They were known as tchotchkes, but what isn't very known is that the Inca actually adopted this method of communication along the road and path networks throughout the empire from the Wari culture.
garbage in there.
It was my assumption that what had been here in the caves were likely burials or some sort of offerings, but it was clear that looters had been there, as there was trash in each of the little alcoves. I expected them to be a bit deeper.
Dead bird in there.
But I could easily see that the interior walls didn't go but a few feet into the mountain.
Alright, well, the wall ends down there, so I can see everything I need to.
The lens on the GoPro got a little blurry from the dust, but it becomes clearer here shortly.
Totally see this being the resting place of a mummy. Oh! Can't hit my head on the rocks, and it all came crashing down on me.
I was able to see that the path continued in the direction of the structures that were tucked away and on the peaks, so I followed in that direction.
So, this is where I am. On this little itty bitty footpath. Because I saw on the drone over this ridge, or over this ridge and maybe the next one, there are 100% structures. They're built all along the tops of these mountains. So, stay tuned.
As I made my way through this section here, I was beginning to see the remnants of ancient walls.
And here they begin. You can see a little mini wall up there. This is the view. So, let's see what's over there.
At various points in the cultural history of Peru, groups would often build fortresses or defensive structures during times of warfare. And I wondered if this is what was up on these mountain peaks. That, in addition to the footpaths, created the assumption that this was probably the Wari culture, whose culture spanned from roughly 450 to 1000 CE and dominated the coastal and highland regions of Peru. I was only seeing a few pieces of pottery scattered throughout my exploration of this site, and these here were the most impressive sherds.
It's a nice piece of pottery.
Typically, I'll find countless pottery fragments, so the lack of them created this idea that perhaps this site was abandoned at some point. In a few places, I was seeing reeds and thatch buried in the debris, which clearly does not naturally grow this high, so it indicated to me that there had been purposeful construction here at some point. Thatch and reeds that are found to grow closer to the riverbed in any given valley were typically used in an adobe mud mixture to help make roofs and walls for the cultures that once lived in these regions. There was also this huge piece of wood here, likely from the huarango tree, which was used to make support beams for ancient architecture. I couldn't piece together any other reason why this would be all the way up here, as it seems to have not grown here for quite some time. As I crossed this boundary here, I began to see the bulk of the structures.
There. Holy sh... Found it.
My instinct is to say that this was terracing. The sloping layered construction was a staple of Wari innovation because their approach to terracing was extremely efficient at conserving scarce water, and their soils could remain damp for months after irrigation, even in the harshest of conditions. I wonder what happened here, because it was clear that the majority of walls that once stood had been reduced to rubble over time. Perhaps an earthquake or a series of environmental catastrophes took their toll over the past several millennia. I still wanted to make it to the structures along the peaks, so I followed along this path, guided by this ancient wall. It is said that the Wari culture began to deteriorate around 800 CE due to prolonged drought, so it could be possible that this site was long abandoned before whatever destructive forces left it in ruin. You could see faint structures in the distance down the other side of the mountain here. I began my ascent along the ridges. It's difficult to put into words, but as I was walking along the ridges and soaking in the majesty of the environment, the view, and the history, I was overcome by deep gratitude for this experience, and definitely some excitement.
Thank you! Thank you! Thank you for my life. Vultures are circling me. Not today.
At first, a few vultures began circling overhead. But very quickly, within just a few minutes, 3 or 4 vultures turned into 8 or 9.
Not today.
And it was a little unsettling because they're pretty large creatures. I would find that out as some hovered eerily close. As I got to the first peak, this section here, there were pottery sherds and clear room-like structures and walls. But everything was in shambles. There seemed to be an offering of maize here, but since it's the only one I saw, I wonder if some animal had housed its stash here. As I continued to make my way to the next ridge, I realized there weren't very many looting pits this high up, and I wasn't seeing any bones, so either looters had not made it up this far and things were still buried, or I'm circling back to my assumption that this site was likely abandoned. Now, I'm sure that some of these rooms were likely living quarters, but I also wondered if the purpose of some of these were, in fact, defensive fortifications. Maybe to watch over and protect the agriculture that was being farmed from the terraces. I went as far along this wall on the edge of the next cliff here and turned back. There weren't any structures there, so I began the descent back down, but along the way, I was able to do another pass through these ruins. It dawned on me that they probably served multiple purposes. Being this high up definitely allowed them to be lookout points for any potential rivaling clans, but they also could have been used for storage for the settlement below, the one I first entered by the road. I could only imagine what this place must have looked like when it was actively being used, and how high the walls actually went. Again, I was definitely shocked to not find these areas along the peaks full of looting pits. But there was that one area at the base that was, where I had parked the car. And it was littered with looting pits, and it was also the last spot on the itinerary to check out.
Clearly, digging went on here.
This is definitely where the deceased were buried. As is usual with looted areas, you can see copious amounts of trash peppered throughout.
Liquor bottles.
Here you can see the bones of ancestors still commingled with the textile they were once wrapped in. This place had definitely been ravaged, and it's hard to believe because it's so common that the resulting feelings are typically ones of normalization, which is just sad. You can see a soda bottle here next to a piece of skull. These are definitely textiles that were once wrapped around mummies. And here you can see the scalp that has been removed or fallen off of the skull next to it. Although the degrees of desecration can vary, I have yet to come across an ancient site in Peru where at least a portion of it hasn't been disturbed by looters. It's an unfortunate reality of the way things are down in these regions. A lot of times at these unknown ancient sites, all you really have to go on is the assumptions you can make based on the history and the location that that particular site might be in. But as you can clearly see, there's typically a ton of artifacts that could be carbon dated and give us a better, more accurate understanding of the history of this area. Those high altitude ruins speak of a different kind of existence, one of defense, vigilance, and mastery of this rugged, arid landscape. We have now witnessed the tragedy of these cultures, their mysteries, their beliefs, and their ingenuity. But to conclude this journey, we visit a place that offers a glimmer of hope. A lost city where enough remains intact that we can literally walk through these ancient streets, and we can feel the vibrant world that was once here. As I was making my way back north from Nazca in the Inca region of Peru, I stayed overnight in the Palpa area, just slightly north, to check out a few sites. My Airbnb host told me of an ancient city that he said was fondly known as the Machu Picchu of the Inca region by locals. It was a site I had never heard of before, so I decided to add it to the itinerary, and I made my way to check it out. This was La Ciudad Perdida de Guayuri.
So the site, the principal site spans about 12 hectares, which is amazing, but the area that they utilized was 22 hectares.
The city and its people flourished between 1150 CE and 1450 CE, and the location, being tucked into a ravine between the mountain ridges, likely served the culture well for multiple purposes at the time, offering both a defensive strategic position as well as affording the opportunity for layered terracing along the mountain slopes in order to sustain agriculture.
Some solid construction.
Walking up to the first structures, there were a ton of pottery fragments, but looking into what I thought was a pit revealed that it was actually a large piece of ceramic, fully buried. Perhaps it had been covered over time due to the elements, but it's also possible that maybe food was being stored, and being placed underground may have helped with the preservation of this resource. It is thought that the elites or the ruling class lived in these upper sections here, while the general population lived in more modest homes further into the basin in these areas. There has been archaeological evidence in some places at this location that indicate layers of occupation which actually date back even further to about 100 CE. To me, that simply furthers the notion that frequently sites and locations were occupied, abandoned, and then reoccupied by subsequent cultures. This is the path I took headed through the site. And on the right you can see what is left of the immense terracing on the mountain that the culture had constructed here. And this ancient road went through the entire site.
These walls, it's incredible.
Most cultures here on the coast specialized in using adobe bricks and mud mixed with thatch and reeds for their structures.
Holy hell. It doesn't stop.
And stone construction like this was mainly found in the highlands. And so it's been assumed that the Wari were an offshoot of a civilization that came down from the highlands and likely commingled with or influenced the local Paroma culture and then settled in the valley here. And it's probable that those coming from the highlands were likely some of the last of the Wari culture. Not only do the structures themselves speak to that likelihood, but the site also shows the advanced terracing that the Wari were known to have innovated. Seeing how high the walls were that still stood, I could only imagine what things must have looked like when this was a thriving city. This was definitely a high level of sophistication that went into the construction of this site.
How cool is this?
Artifacts prescribed to prior occupations were likely those of the Nazca and Paracas cultures, and artifacts dated to the time of the Wayuri indicate a substantial trade network with other indigenous groups in the surrounding regions. From the drone you can see channels going through the city, and archaeologists have found that these would help disperse the rainfall to other parts of the city. Evidence of llama caravans have also been found, which, naturally coming from the highlands of Peru, suggest probable conflict with the Inca Empire. That conflict, in addition to a lack of rainfall and the encroaching Spanish conquest, are the circumstances believed to have led to the downfall or abandonment of this location. Walking the silent streets of a city like this, you can almost hear the echoes of the past. It stands as a powerful testament to what can endure, but it also serves as a stark reminder of what's been lost. Those miles of open graves we first witnessed in the desert. This is the profound duality of these lands, a history of breathtaking genius, living side by side with a modern tragedy of indifference and destruction. We came searching for lost civilizations, but what we found is a fragile legacy, a story written in stone, textile, and bone, threatened with being erased by shifting sands and human greed. The great empires of this region, the Paracas, the Nazca, the Wari, and the Inca, well, they're all gone, and their voices are silent. So now it falls on us to uncover, discover, and tell their stories. And that's the purpose of this channel, to bear witness, to document, to remember. Because we cannot save what we don't know exists, and the search for the past is never truly over. For every question answered, well, a new mystery is unearthed, and Pillars of the Past plans to be on the front lines. So thank you for joining me on this expedition. If you want to support the next expedition, there's a link in the description below. Please put a like on this video if you enjoyed it, and share it with anyone you think might find it interesting. Definitely leave a comment. I'd love hearing what you all think about these sites, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. As always, I truly appreciate you joining me, and I'll catch you in the next video.